welcome to the deep dive. If you're keeping an eye on global power shifts, you've probably bumped into a term that's really gaining ground, and it's one that actively challenges, core Western political thinking, the civilizational state.
Yeah, it's definitely more than just a catchy phrase. It's really a structural challenge to the way we've thought about the global order. For over 150 years, the Western nation-state model, one nation, one state, was seen as the end point, right? The peak of political evolution.
Exactly.
But now there's this counter idea, mainly coming out of China, saying, hang on, there's a different form, much older, rooted in deep, continuous culture, and maybe that's the future.
So our mission today is to take a deep dive into the sources talking about this. We want to unpack why this civilizational state idea is getting so much global traction, how it critiques the whole nation-state setup.
And crucially, why the West seems so, uncomfortable, almost unable to figure out how to respond.
Yeah, uneasy is a good word.
And we really have to start with that quote, the one that really nailed the anxiety back in 2020. It was British journalist Lucian Noman.
Oh, right. A specter is haunting the liberal West, the specter of the rising civilizational state.
That's the one. It just cuts right through. Noman was basically saying this new model is setting itself apart from what he called an increasingly paralyzed Western liberal order.
It's positioning itself as the dynamic alternative, the one with history on its side. Okay, so before we get deeper, let's pin down the definition. How do the sources define the modern Chinese civilizational state?
They frame it as something genuinely new, an unprecedented type. It's a synthesis, so not just looking backward, but a modern fusion of Marxism and traditional Chinese civilization.
The fusion.
Yeah, and that synthesis is key because it supposedly explains the state's ability to do long-term planning, its ideological stickiness, if you like.
Can you maybe elaborate on that? Because for a lot of people, Marxism and ancient Chinese tradition probably sound like polar opposites. How does that actually work together?
Well, that's where the thousands of years of history come in. The argument in the sources is that Marxism gives it the structure, the organization, the discipline, and that focus on, historical direction, a final goal for society.
Okay.
But the values, the principles for governing day-to-day, those apparently come straight from tradition. Things like Confucian ideas of meritocracy, putting the collective good maybe above individual rights, even the old mandate of heaven concept.
Which gets updated.
Exactly. Updated into legitimacy coming from delivering economic growth and governing effectively. So this mix, they argue, allows for both modern economics and deep cultural roots.
Right. That makes the challenge much clearer. Okay, let's tackle the main event. The civilizational state versus the nation state.
Yeah.
How does it critique the Western model?
The critique is pretty sharp. Chinese scholars basically argue the Western nation-state is just outdated. Politically, philosophically, they call it a 19th century nation-state. And the core problem, as they see it, is that the model itself, this idea of one nation matching one state, inevitably creates division and fragmentation.
Okay, hold on. I mean, isn't the nation-state, since Westphalia, the basis of international law? Doesn't it, even with flaws, offer stability and stop empires just running wild, give local people control?
It tries to, sure. But the CS argument is, while it might give some local stability short-term, its strict definitions ethnic, national often build up internal pressures that just shatter the whole thing eventually. Our sources point directly to examples. The breakup of the Soviet Union, the violent collapse of Yugoslavia, even ongoing conflicts and tensions inside India right now. They see these as proof that the nation-state model is too rigid, trying to force diverse people into one often artificial box.
So fragmentation leads to violence, instability. And what's really interesting is how the sources apparently see Europe itself in this light.
Yeah, this is fascinating. They view the whole European Union project, the integration efforts, as this huge, maybe even subconscious attempt by Europe to evolve away from the nation-state.
And towards a civilizational state.
Exactly. But it's incredibly difficult precisely because, as the sources say, Europe's been divided for thousands of years. It just doesn't have that deep, unbroken cultural and administrative unity you find elsewhere.
And the sources have a pretty serious prediction for the EU if it doesn't manage this transition, right?
They do. It's quite stark. The warning is basically, if Europe can't truly unify, get past those historical splits, its overall decline geopolitically, economically, might just be irreversible when faced with these rising unified civilizational powers.
It really shows this isn't just an academic debate in China anymore. This concept is spreading fast.
Absolutely. You've got world leaders picking up the language. President Putin in Russia, for instance, explicitly framed Russia in civilizational state terms, sort of as a defense against what he sees as Western-led chaos. And the list of potential candidates or countries trying to frame themselves this way is growing. Turkey, India. People are even talking about the future of the U.S. through this lens now.
Which brings us neatly to the West's own self-doubt. I mean, you look at someone like French President Macron, and you hear echoes of this systemic uncertainty. His comments back in 2019 were quite something.
Yeah, they really signaled a kind of strategic confusion, didn't they? Macron openly said that rising powers like China, Russia, India see themselves as genuine civilizational states, not just competitors.
And he added that they have.
What was it?
More political inspiration,
Yeah.
a logic, philosophy, and imagination that he felt Europeans had somehow lost. I mean, for a major Western leader to say that, it shows the critique is hitting home.
And that flows right into the next big theme, the crisis of universal values. For so long, the West pushed its specific political values as the standard for everyone. Now, that very idea is under direct fire. The sources don't mince words here. They argue that pushing these universal values often ended up being a kind of imperialism, echoing Samuel Huntington's point from '96.
Right, the clash of civilizations idea.
Exactly. This insistence on one model, they say, ignored civilizational diversity, ignored other ways of organizing politically, and often just led to chaos. They point to things like the color revolutions, various interventions, saying, look, imposing one template causes violence, not stability.
And it seems like the fallout from this failing universal value idea is also hitting hard inside the West. The internal culture wars.
Yeah, we're seeing this really intense polarization in society, which scholars connect to the breakdown of multiculturalism. The sources describe this deep split, framing it as a clash between what they call the white left liberals, focused on moral arguments around immigration, gender issues, and the white right conservatives emphasizing God, family, nation, tradition.
That kind of division must make it incredibly hard for the West to project influence or moral authority anywhere else.
Absolutely. The sources suggest this crisis of authority runs deep. You even have respected Western academics like Christopher Coker or Bruno Messines basically admitting the West isn't really qualified anymore to set universal values.
Maybe not even for itself.
Right. Their credibility to define global norms seems to be crumbling under the weight of their own internal conflicts.
So this raises the identity question. If universal values aren't the glue, what holds the West together?
Yeah.
The sources suggest the concept itself is actually quite recent, quite shallow.
That's the argument. The whole idea of the West really only goes back to around 1848 with Auguste Comte's Western Republic, because it's mostly based on shared political values, not some ancient, unbroken civilizational line. They call it fragile and scattered. That lack of deep historical roots, they argue, is why something like the Russia-Ukraine conflict can so easily strain and fracture Western unity.
Okay, let's compare the identity models discussed in the sources. First, the U.S., the melting pot.
Right, the American model. Popularized by that Israel Zangwill play back in 1909. The melting pot idea really pushed for rapid assimilation, often quite forcefully, into the dominant WASP white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture.
So the American dream was part of that.
Yes, it aimed to kind of politically erase ethnicity, create a common identity based on aspiration. But the result, the sources say, is a society built on isms, not ethnicity, held together by political ideas more than deep shared cultural heritage.
And Europe's multiculturalism, how does that compare?
Well, ironically, the sources trace that back to the colonial tactic of divide and rule. When that approach morphed into modern multiculturalism, it kept a lot of that separation between groups. Now, the argument goes it's kind of stuck, tangled up in political correctness and competing identities, making it really hard to manage.
Okay, now contrast all that with China's claim of continuity. Why do the sources see China as the only truly continuous civilizational state?
It comes down to the civilization itself remaining culturally, linguistically, and geographically connected for, well, over 3,000 years without a major break. That's the key difference.
Unlike, say, Egypt or India.
Exactly. The sources point out modern Egypt has little direct blood or language connection to ancient Egypt. The ancient Indus Valley civilization in India vanished mysteriously. But China, despite dynasties changing, maintained its core cultural and state structure through all that time.
And the Chinese identity model that enabled this.
They call it unity and diversity, Yiri Doyuan. It comes from this long history of multi-ethnic empires built on cultural confidence, respect, and tolerance. The core culture was strong enough to absorb new groups without demanding they completely ditch their own ways. Real integration, not just assimilation.
Is there a specific historical example they use?
Yes, they often mention the Kaifeng Jews in China. Their communities existed for centuries. But the interesting point is how they eventually integrated it wasn't forced, but more due to the host culture's sort of friendly curiosity and capacity to absorb. They were respected, but eventually just blended in, sometimes forgetting their origins, which is seen as proof of the culture's quiet strength.
But we need to add a note of caution here.
Yeah.
Not every attempt to declare a civilizational state is necessarily positive or stable, right?
Absolutely crucial point. The sources use India as a kind of warning. They argue India's current push for a civilizational state identity is heavily tied to manipulating Hinduism for political ends.
And the danger there.
The danger is intense exclusivity. If it's defined purely religiously, it risks excluding huge non-Hindu populations, which is inherently unstable and likely to cause major internal conflict. It's a very different path from the more secular long-term definition China claims.
So putting it all together, the nation-state model seems shaky. Universal values are in retreat. Where does the civilizational state get its broad appeal? Why are people on both the left and the right suddenly interested?
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? For the global left, and even some Marxists, the CS idea offers a powerful way to critique liberal capitalism and what they see as Western imperialism. It's framed as cultural self-assertion against decades of Western dominance.
Okay, that makes sense. And for the...
Right. For conservatives worldwide, who often worry about cultural decadence or excessive liberalism, the CS model appeals as a strong defense of tradition, family, local values. It offers a seemingly solid framework to push back against globalized liberal norms.
Let's bring this back to the U.S. again. The sources suggest its relative youth, its shorter history, is now a strategic disadvantage in this new landscape.
Yes. The argument is that lacking millennia of history means lacking deep wisdom, that strategic foresight you get from living through long historical cycles. So the consequence, they argue, is the U.S. often wins tactical victories, battles, but keeps losing strategically in the long run. Its decision-making lacks that deep historical grounding.
Looking forward then, what's the prediction for the 21st century if this trend holds?
Well, The Economist famously suggested that if the 20th century belonged to the nation-state, the 21st might be the century of the civilizational state. Meaning Western nations might feel forced to drop the whole universalism project and focus much more on protecting their own specific cultures and traditions. Survival mode, almost.
And that points to a huge shift in global alliances, doesn't it? How countries group together.
Exactly. If universal values fade, the world might reorganize around clustering or civilizational integration. We could see alliances forming more along regional lines or deep cultural similarities. Maybe greater integration within the Islamic world or African regions coalescing around shared cultures, perhaps centered on historic hubs like Ethiopia. Less ideology, more deep culture.
So this deep dive really highlights that interest in the civilizational state comes from this double crisis. The nation-state model seems to be fragmenting, and the West's claim to universal moral and political leadership is eroding. The world's clearly moving away from the idea of one single political destination for everyone.
And that completely changes the big geopolitical question, doesn't it? For years, it was Huntington's question, will civilizations clash? But if the world is shifting towards civilizational states being the main players, the really urgent question now becomes, okay, how do they coexist peacefully?
That is the massive question. And the path to that peaceful coexistence, according to the thinking in these sources, needs a kind of elevated cultural outlook.
It does. The final thought weaving through this discourse is that genuine peace has to be built on equality, mutual respect, and tolerance. It means going beyond just liking your own culture.
To actually appreciating the beauty in other cultures.
Precisely. And finding harmony between them. It's summed up in that principle. Mei mei gong tian xie de tong. Basically, recognizing the unique value in all civilizations and working together for a harmonious world.
That's a really profound place to leave it. That shift from just self-appreciation to mutual appreciation. That idea, mei mei gong tian xie tong.
Yeah.
It definitely offers a framework we need for thinking about cooperation in a world that might be increasingly defined by these large civilizational blocks. Something for you to think about as you watch the global pieces continue to move this week.